This is how I study efficiently as a medical student. With this method, I'm able to spend anywhere from 4 to 2 hours a day working on my classwork, and that is enough to get me pretty high grades overall. So the basic technique we're going to talk about is based on this principle of getting high grades as a product of knowledge retention and knowledge application. That's pretty obvious, right? You need to remember stuff and then apply it on questions in order to get good grades. Retention, you can further think of that as a mixture of strong understanding and high efficiency recall. So recall is just another way of saying testing yourself or forcing yourself to remember things from scratch, and it's a very efficient way to train your memory. Then moving on from that, application is just, again, a product of strong understanding and practice problems. Obviously, if you practice doing or using the material in new contexts, such as you would with practice problems, you're going to end up being able to apply material in different forms of questions, and you're going to have more experience and a greater ability to actually use information. Let's talk about strong understanding first, since it's central to both of those components. Strong understanding is what people generally say when they're referring to high-level encoding. So what's encoding? Well, you can think of us as having two boxes for memory. And it's a bit more complex than this, but this is just a simple way to think about it. We have our short-term memory and our long-term memory. When we take in a bunch of sensory information, from textbooks or whatever, it all goes into our short term for obviously a very brief time. Some of that gets processed or encoded, and it goes into our long-term memory. So the goal of strong understanding is in reality to improve and make this encoding process faster and more efficient so that more information gets into our long-term memory. Now, I just want to point out a couple important points here. It is possible to understand something but be unable to apply it, right? So a lot of times you might be able to figure out a derivation or figure out the reason as to why something exists and remember that, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to apply it as needed on your exam. The second thing I want to point out is that just understanding is necessary, but it's not actually sufficient, and it's not the best we can do. So to explain that, I'm showing you a picture of what we call Bloom's taxonomy, and it's a hierarchy of different learning structures that kind of explain how we can think of information and our ability to process it. So at the very bottom, there's remembering, right? So this is just rote memorization, and I think we all know that this is not super helpful. Right above that is understanding, and a lot of people get hung up here, believing this is actually the top of the pyramid, but as you can see, it's clearly not. There are 4 entire levels based off of this graphic that are above understanding that we can take advantage of in order to learn and encode things at a more efficient rate. Honestly, out of these 4, creating is pretty hard for the average student to do. The reason for that is creating is more of like a PhD or discovery sort of process that isn't feasible due to a normal student's time constraints or general abilities. However, evaluating, analyzing, and applying relationships are something we can definitely take advantage of. Alright, so let's talk about the actual technique to encode and make use of those 3 different knowledge hierarchies. For me, I typically encode stuff well through 2 main techniques. The first one is previewing, and the second one is mind mapping. Previewing is pretty simple. It's just a way to look at the information on a big picture level before actually starting to study, which gives you something to hang your knowledge onto. It gives you a basic preliminary structure that makes contextual knowledge more memorable and also allows you to just kind of not get lost in the forest. The way to do this kind of varies depending on your level. If you're at a bit of a lower level in education, like middle through early college, ChatGPT summaries are probably going to work really well. Honestly, I still use those in medical school just because some of the knowledge I have to start with is pretty basic. However, it may hallucinate if you're doing something like a PhD or some other form of higher level education. At that point, you're probably better off using lecture notes and slides or summary sheets or something like that. Okay, so that's the simple part. Mind mapping is a bit more complex, and I think it works so well for me and for other people I've taught because it allows you to really take advantage of these higher levels of knowledge, right? When you make a mind map, you're evaluating, analyzing, and applying the relationships between different concepts, and as we can see, those are higher levels of learning. On top of that, there's a thing called the chunking effect, which is a phenomenon we don't understand super well. We just know that it kind of exists. And the idea of the chunking effect is that our working memory has kind of a cap on what it can remember, but that cap for some reason seems to increase when we chunk stuff. So for example, let's say we have 6 pieces of information. Because there's 6 here, we may not be able to remember all of them. But if we just take this information and move it into 2 groups as such, for some reason our brain's better able to remember this. We don't fully know why, but it's just something that you can take advantage of. Finally, mind mapping does end up allowing you to reorganize information, and that does reduce your memory load. And so a good example of that is this picture here. It might be a bit hard to see, but essentially these are some of the outcomes in a mind map I made about chronic kidney disease. And as you can see, I looked at the accumulative effects of chronic kidney disease, and I broke it into ions, water sodium accumulation, and toxin accumulation. And each of these has different, endpoints all throughout. And just this sort of reorganizing structure is more memorable, and on an exam, I'm able to kind of recreate this logic to remember all this information instead of just having to memorize it in a different way. Speaking of, let's talk about memorization. So you're going to reach a point where you do need to memorize rote details, and there's no way around that, so you might as well get it as efficiently as you can. There are 2 key principles to be aware of when you're trying to memorize information, and those are active recall and spaced repetition. So active recall is this concept that you must test yourself and try to remember things in order to strengthen your working memory of whatever you're working with. There are many techniques you can use in order to use active recall. A few common ones are flashcards, sketches, brain dumps, or teaching. These are all good options. They just allow you to kind of test yourself at a routine interval so that you don't forget things. The second concept that's important to this is spaced repetition. The idea behind spaced repetition is that you want to review stuff at an interval where you're not forgetting too much and it's not becoming too difficult to use active recall, but you also don't want to do stuff every day, such that you're spending hours and hours studying per day. So let's talk about scheduling first, since it's pretty easy. If you're using flashcards, an app like Anki or Quizlet, those are really good because they have automated scheduling built in. I think Quizlet might be paid for that, but Anki should be free as far as I know. Anki also has a different add-on feature and a whole bunch of other stuff that works really well, so I'd recommend using it over Quizlet. And then as far as using active recall and spaced repetition on your mind maps, you really want to have an automated system that does this. So I actually have a Google Sheets script in the description that kind of automatically sets intervals for whatever you put in there, so at a day, a midweek, a 1 week, and a 1 month revision, and then populates a to-do list in an app called Todoist to essentially tell you what you need to do each day. You can adjust these intervals based on your need. So I typically do all of these, with the exception of the week one, sometimes as a medical student. If you're doing a less intensive course load, like early college or anything before that really, then you may need to skip the midweek one and just do 1 day, 1 week, and 1 month. This is just kind of what my system looks like. So this is the thing I was talking about earlier. I'll put a topic here, and then I'll put the day I finish the mind map, and then it'll automatically populate the revision date, the teaching date, and the brain dumping date. And all of those will then be sent into my to-do list app. All right, let's talk about flashcards a little bit more in detail. The first thing I just want to quickly cover is using physical versus digital flashcards, because a lot of people seem to think that physical is somehow better. There are some minor advantages to using physical flashcards, such as, the increased neural connections from writing stuff down. It is beyond minor. Don't do physical. The digital flashcards optimizations, such as automatic scheduling and tracking and being able to edit on the fly and share between devices, makes it way more worth it, in my opinion. And honestly, I think there isn't a single person who's in higher education who would use physical over digital flashcards. And again, I posted the Anki settings in the description. All right, other than that, you want to really make cards with single testable facts. You don't want to have like 10 facts on each card, because then if you remember like 3 but forget 7, what are you going to do? Do you mark it as easy or hard, right? And then you also want to avoid cues. So if you have a card and it's like blah, 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 blank, blah, 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 and you just remember these words here and these words here, and you associate them with a blank, but you don't actually remember the card itself, then you're going to get the card right, but you're going to get the test question wrong. And so if you find this happening, and when it happens, you definitely will know, you just have to kind of reword the card or do something to it so that, you end up actually having you end up actually getting use out of the time spent on flashcards. Finally, there are 2 ways in which you can do flashcards. You can either do a daily block or small bursts throughout the day. When you're starting off with flashcards, you probably want to do a daily block. This is because you're probably going to use a pre-made deck, or if you're making your own flashcards and you're not quite as good as encoding as you could be, then you're going to have to do a lot of flashcards. When you start getting into like hundreds of flashcards a day, it's very annoying to do them in small bursts. However, once your encoding is high enough and you're able to get away with a lot fewer flashcards and spend most of your time really recreating mind maps and reteaching and all that sort of stuff, then you really should move to small bursts throughout the day. It's much more manageable and it's a much nicer experience. Let's talk about sketches. Sketches are a cool technique. I was kind of introduced to this for the first time in medical school, and I got very frustrated that nobody had taught me about this sooner. Sketches are a technique where you take some sort of information that's very hard to just understand, or, something that you have to rote learn, and you transcribe it into some physical or visual representation that's more memorable. I'm not going to go through the slide just because it's way easier to go for an example. So here's a sketch I've done with ChatGPT. And in essence, these are the various causes of acute tubular necrosis, right? So this is just a disease. You don't need to know what it is. But it has like 100 different causes, and it's a pain to do like 10 flashcards for these. However, through this sketch of a ninja running away from some goblins, I have most of the causes identified. So over here, this ninja is using a weapon called a sai, which reminds me of aminoglycosides. He has a contrasty headband, reminding me of contrast. He's in the sewers, reminding me of uremia. And then the sewers also remind me of lead for some reason, so there's that as well. The goblins back here remind me of myoglobin, or as I think about it, myogoblin. And then their ice magic reminds me of antifreeze. And so that covers a lot of those sort of situations. And just by remembering this image and maybe throwing it into a flashcard, I have all those things memorized with very little upfront effort on my end. Just going back to the slide really quick, make sure you use imagery that's relevant to you. So this is actually supposed to be the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. ChatGPT didn't play along with that, so I had to compromise. But, in other cases, I would have more obviously made it tied to my own personal experiences and things I found memorable. These aminoglycosides, this is a cue that I'd learned using, a public source sketch program all the way like a couple months ago, and so it's relevant for me. But if you see, ninja size, you might not immediately think of aminoglycosides. You just need to keep it relevant to you. The other thing is you want to keep themes common throughout multiple sketches so that when you have, consistent imagery, that imagery's association gets strengthened in your mind. So if I had another sketch where I had to talk about myoglobin or aminoglycosides, I would use the same either goblins or weapons to represent them. I wouldn't try to come up with a new theme, even if it was more fitting for that specific sketch. All right, let's talk about teaching as well. You want to teach out loud. The reason is when you kind of teach silently in your head, you end up just assuming that you know some stuff or that you're able to explain some key concepts when in reality you're not able to do that. So you really want to help identify gaps in your knowledge in order to get those top marks, and you need to do that through teaching out loud. You also want to assume the hypothetical student knows nothing, and that's kind of for the same reason. All right, let's talk about brain dumps. Brain dumps are very obvious. You just write out everything you know. If you're taking notes in a mind map format, you basically want to recreate that mind map as best you can. You're inevitably going to miss details. It's very hard to get 100% recall, especially if your mind map is sufficiently big. In these situations, depending on why you missed it, you can either reformat and reorganize your mind map and then try again, or you can just throw that information to a flashcard or a sketch or whatever. All right, Practice questions are fairly self-explanatory. Obviously, the best sources are going to be past exams or quizzes. Beyond that, you do have online question sources. So medical students use something called UWorld. If you studied for the MCAT, which is a test in the United States that pre-meds have to take in order to get into medical school, you would have heard of UWorld as well. But these really are your gold standard up here. Now, if you have time, I like to do what's called the double pass method. This is where you take your practice exam once. So if you have your paper, you go through it one time. And then once you're done, you then get your textbook or your resources or whatever, and you go through it the second time. And then you compare between these two and see the differences in your knowledge. Then you can go ahead and check it. And hopefully with the textbook, you would have gotten 100%. If not, then those are really key areas because they suggest a huge gap in your understanding, right? And beyond that, there's not really much else to say. Those are the basics of the techniques. I'll post more in-depth walkthroughs and guides later on, but this should be a good foundation.